Well, now I would like to invite our next expert, Dr. Alice OLLINO, who will be addressing the due diligence issue on marine environmental protection, prospects and perils. You have the floor, Dr. OLLINO.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank the Korean Society of International Law and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for this kind invitation. And before I start, I think I have to, a premise is in order. Some of you might have seen from my short bio that international law of the sea, it's not my areas of expertise. Yet I've spent a good deal of time studying due diligence over the past few years. So what I hope to contribute with my presentation today is to make use of the general framework of due diligence and shed some conceptual questions on the nature of due diligence obligation as they apply in relation to the protection of the marine environment. So recently, there has been much scholarly attention into the topic of due diligence, and certainly one of the reasons of this renovated interest is due to the contributions of ICLS, started from the advisory opinion of 2011 on the responsibility of states in the sponsoring area. But one questions, or like one areas of due diligence obligations that is relatively unexplored or less explored, concern what I call and when I define the proceduralization of due diligence obligation, which is very much, which will be the focus of my presentation today. And by proceduralization of due diligence obligation, I intend that process whereby the standards which are traditionally linked to due diligence, so reasonableness, good governmentality, and extra-legal parameters, are progressively eroded and give space to legal parameters, so substantive duties, procedural duties, procedures, that make up the content of due diligence obligation. So I will explore this process today in relation to due diligence obligation related to the protection of the marine environment, and I will make some comments on, let's say, the potentials of this process and some of the implications. So I will structure the presentation as follows. For the remaining parts of the time, I will first provide a very brief but necessarily account of due diligence. And what is due diligence, and then I will focus on due diligence obligations related to the protection of the marine environments and explore the proceduralization of these obligations. And my main argument is that proceduralization is achieved mainly in two different ways, either via treaties or through the interpretative practice of international courts and tribunals. And then in the third part, I will offer some critical remarks on the potential of this process and some of the, let's say, perils or potential negative implications of proceduralization. So let's say the most problematic aspects of proceduralization. So what is due diligence? As many of you will know, due diligence is mainly an identifier for particular classes of primary rules. And due diligence help basically identifies rules that and primary rules that shares a number of common elements and characteristics. And I would say that these characteristics are at least three. So we are dealing with obligation and primary rules of conduct nature. Now, I know that the distinction between obligation of conduct and obligation of results is a source of confusions at times, both in practice and in doctrine, but let's say that by duties of conduct, and here, of course, I refer also to what the ICLS said in both its advisory opinion on due diligence obligations, means best effort duties. So states are required to exercise their best effort towards the achievement of some results, but without guaranteeing the attainment on that result. Second, international obligations interpreted through the prism of due diligence are usually obligations that are connected to the concept of risk. So risk which are to a certain extent outside the sphere of control of states. So normally we are dealing with obligations that are either connected to the activities or of non-state actors, or we are dealing with obligation that relates to activities that are risky per se or carry an inherent element of risk, like dangerous activities. And third, those are flexible obligations. So if we, so obligations then grant states much leeway as to the measures to be adopted to fulfill due diligence. So if we look at treaty practice, normally we would identify as due diligence obligations that requires the adoption of all necessary measure or adequate measures, reasonable measures, and so on and so forth. So although it is not possible, of course, to provide an exhaustive list of obligation classified as due diligence, I would say that at least obligation to prevent, obligation to protect, obligation to promote, obligation to ensure are normally classified as such, and I would also argue obligation to cooperate or obligation to negotiate, at least to a certain extent. So this is why UNCLOS is a source of obligations of due diligence, and we find numerous obligations of due diligence related to the protection of marine environment in UNCLOS. So Article 192, so the general obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment, then Article 207 to 211 that provides for the prevention, reduction, and control of marine pollution, of the marine environment from land-based sources in connections to seabed activities and so on. So the reason why, in relation to these primary rules, we normally invoke the concept of due diligence is because by referring to due diligence, basically we provide rule with substance, meaning, and a rationale. And it is in that sense, to that extent, that, in my opinion, we can talk about a principle of due diligence in this sense. So if we take a review of international practice, and that wouldn't be just related to international law of the sea, but more in general to different areas of international law, we see indeed that by invoking due diligence, courts and tribunals, or interpreters more generally, provide a certain substance to primary rules interpreted through this prism. And this substance relates to some common parameters which are mostly extra-legal, or at least they are imbued with extra-legal concept. So I don't have, for reasons of time, I don't have, I won't delve into that. But let's say that the most common parameters that define the content of due diligence is, of course, reasonableness. And again, drawing on the findings of ICLS, ICLS says in relation to Article 139 and the responsibility of sponsoring states, or the obligation to ensure that any failure of the sponsoring states to act reasonably would be or could be a challenge before the dispute chamber. So reasonableness would be the overarching parameter through which we interpret a due diligence rule. But then we find other extra legal parameters, such as knowledge of the risk. So the riskier the activity, the greater would be the degree of diligence required by the primary rule. Power of the source of risk, vigilance, so a certain amount of vigilance that the state would have to adopt, and state's capability. That, of course, depends on the content of the primary rules, but again, another extra legal parameters. So the reasons why I'm, let's say, emphasizing this is because the use of these extra legal parameters to interpret and to construe due diligence is exactly the reason why we tend to say that due diligence obligations are elusive obligations. They are, let's say, vague obligation. Some of these remarks were also made today during several presentations where obligations to prevent or obligation to protect were were invoked. And the reason we say this is because extra-legal parameters always ask for an assessment in concreto. So it is impossible to, let's say, describe due diligence a priori and in abstracto and require states and to identify all the measures required. So these are obligations, let's say, structurally difficult to pin down in the abstract. Now, contrary to other areas of international law, in the context of the protection of the marine environment, however, we are witnessing, to a certain extent, to a proceduralization of due diligence, which means that these extra-legal parameters, and I'm referring especially to reasonableness, but reasonableness wouldn't be the only extra-legal parameters which would be objectified, are gradually eroded and replaced with legal parameters. So objective duties, substantive duties, procedural duties, and standards, which together make up the content of what is due for a state in a particular situation. So proceduralization occurs mainly two ways. So as I said at the beginning, one way to proceduralize due diligence obligations is via treaty. And I think that Article 211 of UNCLOS provides a good example of this. So according to these provisions, states are required to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from vessels. And if we compare this rule with Article 207, for instance, which grants much more leeway to states as to the measures to be adopted to prevent pollution from land-based sources, and this article makes reference, for instance, to state capability, well, if we look at Article 211, especially paragraph 2, it says that states in preventing pollution shall apply and shall adopt measures and regulations which are no less onerous that generally recognize rules and standards. Thus, this reference to generally recognized rules and standards, of course, refers back to other conventions, to internationally agreed standards. And here, for example, the MARPOL Convention, International Maritime Organization Codes, or the Ballast Water Management Convention, the London Dumping Convention, would all provide for standards that define the content of the duties of states. So, of course, states that are bound by this obligation are bound by this obligation because they are party to it, but somehow they would be also required under the due diligence rule provided by UNCLOS under Article 211 to abide by these standards. And we might say that if these standards are generally recognized in the sense that annexes to MARPOL, for example, are widely ratified by states, that might be generally recognized, and therefore states which are party to UNCLOS but are not parties to this annexes or to the MARPOL Convention would be nonetheless required to adopt measures and regulation which are none less onerous than international standards. So this one would be one first way to proceduralize progressive due diligence obligation. So again, if we take the example of MARPOL Convention, we would have numerous annexes which are updated in time, and that would also allow us to, let's say, update the content of due diligence according to scientific developments. And the second way to proceduralize due diligence obligation, which is probably the more interesting, at least from a theoretical perspective, is certainly through the interpretative practice of courts and tribunals. And of course, the advisory opinions of ICLS here would offer excellent examples of this kind of proceduralization. So I will only focus on one aspect in that regard. If we take again the advisory opinion of 2011 on the responsibility of states in the area, so the tribunal there recognized that the obligation to ensure is an obligation of due diligence, and then recognized a number of direct obligations that is stated, well, these are directed obligations that states have to fulfill nonetheless, such as the obligation to apply the precautionary approach, the obligation to conduct an environmental impacts assessment, the obligation to assist the authority in the exercise of control over the activity, and so on and so forth. But the CBES dispute chamber also said that these obligations, these direct obligations, are part of the due diligence rule. So in my opinion, this is again another way to proceduralize duties, in the sense that to fulfill the obligation, the primary obligation to ensure, states would also have to abide by this direct obligation. Now, what are the potential of this process of proceduralization, and what are, let's say, the critical implications? So as far as the positive implications are concerned, I think they are quite self-explanatory. So I will point to three. So first of all, by proceduralizing due diligence obligation, of course, we are infusing due diligence obligation with legal certainty. So to a certain extent, by replacing extra legal parameters with more legal ones, we are, let's say, giving normative density to this obligation, and to a certain extent, we are overcoming so the critiques over the elusiveness of their nature. Second, proceduralization is also an excellent way to enlarge the scope of obligations of primary rules, and I will come back to this shortly. But mainly when we proceduralize duty, we tend to enlarge the scope of primary rules of due diligence. And third, there is a possibility to assess responsibilities of states for violations of due diligence. And I think this is of critical importance, specifically when we talk about obligations of due diligence, such as obligation to prevent, like obligation to prevent pollution. So we know that according to, if we stick to Article 14, Paragraph 3 of the ILC Articles on State Responsibility, the breach of preventive obligation is contingent upon the occurrence of an event, which in this case would be damage or environmental damage. And this makes it problematic for interpreters and for adjudicators to find violation of obligations to prevent. And of course, by proceduralizing duties of due diligence and by providing for direct these duties, we are also providing a way for interpreters to find violations of direct obligation, in this sense circumvent, let's say, these problems. And of course, here there is an analogy also with the work done by the ICJ in relation to the content of the obligation to prevent transboundary harm and the development of procedural obligation in that sense. But I would also argue that there are some perils, or at least, let's say, some aspects which might be problematic, or at least should be taken into account. So when it comes to proceduralization through treaties, I would say that the problem here is just that, of course, we are subjecting the proceduralization of duties to the political will of states. So of course, states may decide, may or may not decide to be parties or adopt or consent to annexes or to certain conventions which will provide for international standards and rules. And of course, also the process of proceduralizing duty is slower than the process of proceduralization when it occurs at the ends of courts and tribunals. But again, I would say that it is more interesting to focus on proceduralization through the interpretative practice of courts and tribunals in that sense. And my argument is that at times, the outcome of proceduralization, when this process occurs through courts and tribunal, may be hard to square, or let's say hard to reconcile with at least, let's say, positivist views that tend to separate the interpretation from lawmaking practices and construe lawmaking as an expression of state consent. And I will explain this with one example, which would be the arbitral case of 2016 of the South China Sea arbitration case. So at some point in that decision, the tribunal was asked to interpret Article 192 of UNCLOS, which require to prevent and to protect the marine environment. And in defining that obligation as an obligation of due diligence, the tribunal refrained from treating the question of due diligence as a question of fact. So again, refrained from using extra-legal parameters, and instead drawing on the corpus of international law of the environment, and specifically on the CITES Convention, of both which the Philippines and China were party, established and derived a novel obligation to prevent the harvesting of marine species that are recognized to be internationally at risk of extinction. So now this would be an excellent example of how to enlarge the scope of due diligence obligations, so strengthen the protection of the marine environment, coming back to the potential of this process. But then, on the other hand, this, again, may be hard to square with those who think that the role of interpreters and law-applying body should be to apply the law and not to, let's say, create new rules. Sure, one may say, well, positivists do not deny that rule may be vague in content, maybe have an open-ended substance, and that is true. And when this happens, this leaves and grants more leeway to interpreters as to the substance of the rule. But in my opinion, yet, one thing is to replace the substance of a vague and open-ended rule with parameters like reasonableness, good governmentality, which to some extent make the assessment of the obligation still contingent upon the case. So what is reasonable shall be assessed also according to the circumstances. In this case, of course, we are injecting, let's say, a certain substance to the rule, but at the same time, we are not normatively impinging on the flexibility of the rule. A different thing is instead to make due diligence a catalyzer for the creation of new obligations and standards, so to substitute extra-legal parameter with legal parameters. In the case of the South China Sea arbitration, we might say then and now the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment.
Excuse me. Yes, Dr. Ollino, yes, maybe you can conclude your presentation or to leave space for this. Thank you very much.
I have finished.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yes, okay, thank you. Shall I conclude my I had finished actually. I just wanted to say that a different thing would be to, let's say, substitute extra legal parameter with legal one, and in this case, it is hard to say that we are going close into the creation of new legal rules. Thank you.
Sorry, my apologies for interrupting you, but because it was a very interesting discussion, presentation, I could go ahead for a while.